Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another one of the Bay Area Discovery Museum's live chats. My name is Janine Oakman. I'm Director of Education at the Bay Area Discovery Museum, broadcasting to you from my home in San Francisco, California. We are actually this morning continuing a conversation that we started last week about creating child-directed environments for learning. And I introduced the pedagogical framework that we use at the museum. We call it the CREATE framework. It is a research-backed method that we have that guides us in the creation of experiences that enable children to thrive, to play, to learn, to cultivate their creativity. And we talked specifically about the first letter in our CREATE framework, the C, which stands for child-directed. And we're here to continue that conversation today with one of my colleagues who is, I see her, I haven't seen her in person in a long time, Michelle Barreras, who is the head of the Discovery School at the Discovery Museum. The Discovery School is our on-site preschool. You may or may not know we have an on-site preschool. It's a really special place that uses all the resources of the museum to create these amazing child-centered experiences. So Michelle is here to talk to us today about how to design environments for child-directed play, to share tips from the Discovery School that can be implemented in the home. So a couple of housekeeping things before I turn things over to Michelle. Michelle's going to share thoughts, ideas, suggestions from the school. If you have questions for her, if you have comments, if you want to share what you've been doing at home that really works, please feel free to do so in the chat or use the Q&A function. Right now, everybody is muted. And if you have something that you'd like to say, we're happy to have you say that live. Just raise your hand and we will know to call on you. We've also gotten some feedback that folks who are following us are really interested in learning a little bit more about how we can support very young children, toddlers, preschoolers, infants. And Michelle is the woman for this job. Not only does she oversee our preschool, but she also oversees 2 child caregiver classes, Curious and Capable, which is a class for very young children, infants and babies and their caregivers, as well as Discover Together, which is a class for young toddlers and their caregivers. So with that, I am going to turn things over to my colleague, Michelle, to talk a little bit more with us.
Hi, I'm Michelle Barreras, as Janine just very thoughtfully introduced me to you. And I want to start off by saying that no matter what, I want all of you to feel as though you are already doing a good job, because you already are. This is an incredibly challenging and intense time. And so I want you to first and foremost remember that. And the tips that I'll be sharing with you today and the chat we're going to have is just going to hopefully enrich what you already are doing. And we'll gladly answer any questions and offer any advice. And Janine described me as an expert, but I also want to emphasize I'm still learning too. I always think of myself as always learning. And my experience does allow me to share what I've learned over the 30 years that I've been in early childhood education. I'm also a parent to 3 children who are now all teenagers. But, and so now my home has to sort of reflect the lives of 3 teenagers and their parents. And so, but I also had experience when they were younger of creating a space that reflected their needs at that age as well. So the first thing I think would be important to talk about is just the environment and the importance of environment. And I'm going to start there because the environment is really powerful. And so in order to create a space where where young children can be child-directed, or it can be open to them, you have to first think about the power of an environment. And so an environment really can speak to us through our emotions. It can make us feel certain ways. It can tell us sort of how time can be structured in that space. It tells us about the roles that are played in that space, and even the expectations of behavior. So an environment influences us in many ways. And there's always a story that I like to reflect upon when I think about environment that someone else shared at one time. He was a teacher and he was taking his children on a school field trip, and they were, I think it was preschoolers, and they went to the airport and they were in the terminal. And then he was very surprised at how the children then reacted in that space. But when you think about it, it really makes sense. So there's this large open space, big hallway, big space open. What did the children do once they got into that space? They ran because that's what the space says to do for a young child. So I start there so that we can start to think about, like, what does our space say to our children and our families? It's really important to think about that. Another thing that I want to bring up too is considering child development is also going to be really important. So when you think about creating spaces that can be child directed, you have to think about the development of your child. And so we have to think about their cognitive development, their physical development, their social emotional development, and their capabilities within that time period as infants, toddlers, preschoolers, kindergartners, or school-age children, because that's going to also make a difference about the types of activities that you're offering and the types of materials that you would use within those activities as well. The other thing to consider too, beyond just your child's development, is also their interests, because their interests should really also be a driver in what you are considering to create in your space to offer those children or your child. So anyway, when you think about child development, there's three things that I want to highlight. Children are always learning. That is their role in life. Like, that is what they're doing. No matter what, they are always learning, but they learn in a different way than how you or I might think about learning. They really are active learners. So they are learning through experiences. And so that is why when you're in a space with a child, they're always moving, they're always doing, they're always touching, they're always exploring, because that is how they are learning. They are naturally learners. It's just innate. The primary vehicle for children to learn as well is also through play. So thinking about spaces and places where play can be happening is going to be also really important. They also need time for interactions with others. And so currently right now, that's going to be whoever is in your home. So the other adults in your home are going to be who they seek out. And they also like to reflect. Those opportunities to reflect on what's happening and what they're doing also provides time for them to learn. Another really important thing to think about when you think about development is language is also really powerful. Children are really learning through communication, and that plays a critical role in their development. And the primary avenue of communication at these ages is really through language. So those are just some things to really hold when you think about child development. And then now I'm going to kind of turn into thinking about the environment. So when you think about an environment that you want to make as a space that's available to children, you're going to be thinking about their development, so their age, their development, and you're going to be thinking about their interests. And so you might need to sort of reimagine your space and who's that space for? Who's living there at that time? And is there a way to sort of create a space where it can be open for child-directed activities at all times so that you can create a space that has those materials and things that are safe and appropriate for that age of child or that developmental age of the child. But there's also going to be activities that you as the adult might need to set up, but then they can lend themselves to be child-directed during that activity. When I'm saying this, I'm also thinking mostly about older children. So child-directed is going to be mostly for preschool on up. And when I think about infants and toddlers and child-directed, you're really going to need to be there and available because you're going to be the person who's keeping them safe. But it still can be a space that's open and free for them. It's just that the adult is going to need to be there to guide them. So when you think about those things and you think about your home, I want you to think about that space that you're going to create for child-directed activities to happen in. It has to be open for them to be able to get to the things that they need. So accessible and open. you're also going to want to think about it being organized, and they can get to the things that they want and they can see the things that they need. It's also appealing when it's more organized as well. You want the things to be located in the place where they're meant to be used. So if you're going to do something that's sort of messy, like a sensory play activity, think about where that best could be set up. Is it going to be outdoors? Is it going to be on your kitchen floor? Is it going to be in the bathroom, on the bathroom floor? So you're going to want to be thinking about what the activity is and where those materials might need to be located to be used during that activity. That makes the most sense. And you also want to think about it being safe. That's going to be highly important as well. So
Michelle, can I ask you just to pause for a second, because I want to acknowledge a couple of questions that are coming in that are really related to this.
Absolutely.
First of all, there was a question that came to us prior to the start, after we sent out the initial announcement of the topic, which may or may not be the same questioner. But there was one question about keeping a 3-year-old occupied for a longer amount of time. I think you might have seen that. And who doesn't typically engage in an art project, but how to draw out the length of time that a child can be self-directed. And there's another question right now in the chat from Heather, who, Heather, it sounds like a challenging situation, and I relate to this. There's a sibling rivalry question. There's a child who's almost 4 directing a lot of aggression toward a 9-month-old baby. And some of the things Heather says she's tried is designating a space for big kid toys only where the baby's not allowed to go, but not working that great, and thinking about designating a baby only space. There's a challenge. She thinks really the heart of the challenge is that a preschooler is bored and needs a space that can really engage him. Trying to think about strategies to do that.
Sure. So my best. I'm gonna go back to the first question that inquired about a young preschooler and staying engaged in something. Something to think about is that something like an art activity, that's really more of a quiet and activity that might ask for more fine motor skills. And young children actually, when I was mentioning that whole development, there's all areas of their development. And one of the things to keep in mind is active or large motor types of activities. And that might be something that your child might spend longer times engaged in. Is if there's a way to create a space, it might be outdoors, it might be, I would try to think about ways you could also do this inside, because when I think about a 3-year-old boy, I think about like large motor active things. And so I would think about creating a space where wheelbarrows or trikes or balance boards, sweeping, dusting, stairs, movement, creating some sort of obstacle course, building forts, balls that could be used inside, balls that could be used outside. I'm just thinking about large motor movement is a different kind of activity, or construction is also something else. So building, and again, that's where the fort making kind of comes in. So having like cardboard boxes, crates, pillows, sheets, blankets, things like that, would ask for more large body movement, because children really do need to move their bodies. It's actually underlying for all of their development to be moving their whole body. So you want to think about different types of play too. Another thing might be, an answer to that might be something that involves dramatic play. If your child is interested, again, it's going to be thinking about your child's interests. And if your child is interested in dramatic play, you might want to think about the props that are related to the types of interests that your child has shown. So if it's vehicles, if it's a doctor, if it's a carpenter or a farmer, so think about the kinds of props that would encourage that kind of dramatic play. And that also might hold your child's attention for a bit longer duration too. And then the question about the siblings and sort of that wonder of, could it be boredom? I always go to, again, your child's behavior is also communication. And so it could be expressing boredom. I also wonder, I think about social emotional development, and something to consider is that this time, not only are we as adults trying to make sense of what is happening in our world, so are our children. and they know, they sense something is off. They hear it, they hear adults talking about it, they feel it, because obviously their whole world has been turned upside down. They're no longer able to go to the park to play. So it could also have to do with some emotional needs, and it's okay to talk about what's happening and to make room and space for that, and to sort of narrate, you know, I see that you're telling me that you're feeling something right now. Are you feeling frustrated? Are you feeling angry? You want to be able to go to the park. You want to be able to go outside and play in ways with friends that we aren't doing right now. So that might be what that's also communicating. And so something that I think about is when children are struggling with sort of things in their world or making sense of what's happening in their world, time for imagination or dramatic play. You can also see, if you observe their play, you can also see what they're communicating in that play too. So if they're starting to play doctor a lot, or they're talking about germs or things like that, you can tell that they're actually aware of what's happening, and that could be an underlying question that's being communicated. I don't know if that's helpful. Janine, are there other questions that are coming up?
Well, there was one follow-up question about if we're going to be setting up spaces that meet the needs of a child as well as the grown-ups living in a home. This is very practical. Are there any tips for keeping a home organized or a space organized and keeping all of the potential materials and supplies organized?
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna go through just sort of some different types of activities, and then we can sort of talk about like, how would you display and organize those activities? Because I think that'll start to help structure what we're talking about. So when you think about the different types of activities that young children need for their development, as I mentioned, that large motor or active play is something to consider. Construction is another kind of activity, dramatic play, small world play, games, science play, woodworking or construction play, projects that you might be working on at a table. Those are kind of for older children. You might be thinking about artistic or creative experiences. You might be thinking about sensory play, and also language. As I mentioned, language is really important in communication. So time with books, writing materials, or listening to stories, or listening to music. Music would also kind of fall into that area. So when you think about those different types of things and you think about your space, so let's start with like the artistic and creative area. You might think about, well, what's needed for that kind of experience to happen where I might not need as the adult to set it up? What are some things I can put out that my child can just go to on their own and use safely? Again, you're going to have to think about your child's development. But generally, I would say you could have markers, you could have crayons, you could have pencils, you can have different types of paper. You can have glue sticks, you could have hole punchers, possibly a stapler, depending on their age. And you just want to make those things available to them. It's open and it's in the space where it's meant to be used. So nearby, you might want to have a small table. You might want to have an easel if you have an easel in your home, or if you have paper, you can just tape to the wall and define that this is the space that you can draw on a vertical surface, but not on the wall. So that's just one way to start. And then dramatic play, think of a space that can be open for dramatic play. I know when my children were very young, we had a living room, but we really made it more as a space for the children to engage in dramatic play and construction. And I had the art area kind of closer to the kitchen because I knew that would make sense closer to the kitchen. And sensory play, when we did that, we would either do it outside in our little backyard, or I would do it on the kitchen floor, just depended upon the activity.
Michelle, we have a couple more questions coming in.
Sure.
A great suggestion. Alice is thanking you for some of the ideas for 3-year-olds and has a great suggestion about that they use a visual weekday calendar where her child moves a little person from day to day, and that has been a useful tool in their home.
Yes, visuals are good. Visuals are great for young children. they are really visual learners. Excuse me. Excuse me. Learning with visual is also really, really important for young children too. Sorry, I've declared my throat. And and actually having a flow or a rhythm to your day is also going to feed that need to understand what's next. Young children thrive in making sense of their world and the patterns, as we all do actually. And so if there's some sort of flow or rhythm to your day, that's also really helpful. So maybe sensory play happens after lunch. Maybe you're always having cozy time to read together before a nap, so that they kind of learn what to expect, what's coming up next, and changing up what is specific to that activity would give it novelty. But it's also important to have that sort of rhythm to the day, and visuals help.
Great. The other question that's coming in, I think, is actually a really important one. It goes back to the social emotional development. And Deb is asking about how to encourage empathy during this time, that so much of the social emotional engagement that children experience comes from the interaction with their peers at school. And you continue to encourage empathy when they're missing that human to human interaction.
Yeah, don't forget that you're also a human. And so by you modeling and describing your feelings and narrating what has happened, so kind of like sports casting what you're feeling in a moment in time, also models for your child feelings and how you regulate your feelings and what kinds of things happen that provoke certain feelings. And books are also another great resource. So there's always opportunities in picture books to ask your child, how do you think this person's feeling when this, or this character, I shouldn't say person, what this character might be feeling when this particular thing happened, and sort of go into, and you could even share your thoughts too. Oh, I think they might be feeling this because this happened first. So there are many opportunities for cultivating and nurturing and encouraging empathy. It is just using what you have in your home and your space.
Just to add to that, my children are a little bit older, but one thing that we are really trying to model for them and engage in the conversation about is reaching out to people who we know are living alone or in vulnerable populations. So we are really prioritizing calls to the grandparents, calls to an aunt who lives on its own, encouraging them to write notes and letters and to help reach out to people who might not have other people that they're living with or the kinds of networks and family situations that our family has. So showing that what we're doing as grown-ups in the house, but encouraging them to participate in that as well.
And if your children are like, sorry.
Go ahead.
If your children are preschool age, I know something we're doing with our preschoolers right now is we've created a space where they can chat and talk to each other. And we've encouraged, drawing pictures for each other. And when we have our Zoom meetups, they might show their pictures. They might share with each other what they're making and then comment on that or ask questions about it. And then we've also just started using Marco Polo, where they can send messages to each other, video messages to each other, and just as a way to keep those connections and just keep talking about how you're feeling too. Are there any other questions that have come up, Janine?
That is what has come in so far.
Okay. I could go into a little more detail about, I don't know where we're at with time, but I could go into a little detail about those different areas and setting them up. I think one thing I want to emphasize too, and it depends on where you live. I understand we're all living in different spaces, but we all do have access to the outdoor in some way. And I know we have to be careful and mindful about how we use it, but I would very much emphasize that young children do need to get outside. So do make sure that however you can do that safely, that you are making the time every day to get outside. That is really important for their development. And again, just that emphasis on the need, like using the foundational thought of a child's development and the types of activities that they're asking for are really related to their development and to their learning. I could go into a little bit about like sensory play. I think it's also something to keep in mind for young children, preschool age children, and kindergartners still enjoy sensory play as well, and probably even older. But just keeping in mind that I would also make time every day for some sort of sensory play experience. I know the museum posts a lot of great activities. So making oobleck together, making Play-Doh together, playing in water or sand. There's a lot of really good ideas that you can find online too that are non-food related sensory activities. So if you have like an old, like a dish pan that you could use to put things in, you know, like those plastic tubs, or an old container that you don't need for storage anymore, and just put that on the ground and put sensory materials. You can use all your
Michelle, sorry to interrupt you, but can you, just so we're all on the same page, can you define, when you say sensory play, what you mean by that?
Yeah, so sensory play, what I'm imagining is I'm thinking about children and their experience, like playing in sand, playing with water, playing with Play-Doh, anything that's really tactile, and you can add aroma to Play-Doh sometimes. Sometimes you can add a little bit of natural materials that offer a scent, like lavender we've done quite often. So that's what I'm thinking of when I think of sensory play. And then you put things out like measuring cups or rolling pins, things, depending on what the sensory material is. That's sort of what I'm thinking about when I say that.
And can you just give us a word about why is that important for the development of young children?
Sure. So since children
I'm putting you on the spot.
I know, right? I'm like, I didn't prepare that. Children are sensory learners. And as you know, as I mentioned, they learn through experience, like hands-on, they want to be doing. And by giving them opportunities to touch different kinds of textures and explore those textures offers them opportunities to also then make predictions about what might happen using those different types of materials. And then you also want to offer them opportunities to explore different types of, oh gosh, I'm kind of losing track of what I'm saying here, so sorry. But it's a really important way for children to experience. So shaving cream is another great option. I'm sure many of you have seen your child get involved in some of those activities, and they seem to get really caught up in those and can stay at those for long durations of time because it is so it's so rewarding to their senses. Now, some children might withdraw and not want to get their hands dirty, but water might be a good option for children who don't want to get dirty. And then maybe you can explore other types of things.
This is another suggestion that I would have for the parent who, or the caregiver who asked the question about engaging a child who doesn't like art, but for a longer period of time. We see just anecdotally on site at the museum, the sensory table in our art studios, a place where children can just play and play and play in a very open-ended way, but there's something about the tactile experience and just offering some open-ended toys with which they can engage with sand, or we don't use water in that way, but slime, water, clay, that sort of thing is a great opportunity.
Pom-poms. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can put into like a little tub. And I was going to say another thing about that sensory play is it would take you as the adult to set it up. The child-directed piece might be, what would you like to have inside of the sensory tub today? And you give your child a couple options of what you might have to offer. And then once they're playing in it, the props that you would give to them to play in that particular material, again, it's the opportunity for the child-directed piece to happen too.
Great. Those are all such good suggestions, Michelle. And our time is up, but the good news, we're doing this every week. So please join us again next week. The topics will change, but there's always room to answer your questions either live during the session, or you're welcome to email us your questions in advance. You can email them to media@badm.org. That's BADM.org. And we are posting activities, thematic activities every week. We are trying to make sure that they're great options for older children, younger children, and you can find those at www.badm.org/hub, H-U-B. And that's where we have all the activities. We have these recordings that are aggregated. So if you miss something, you want to go back and watch over and over again, you can do that there. Great. Thank you so much, everybody. And Michelle, we're so glad to have your expertise. I hope that sometime we can be in the same room doing this in front of live audiences.
Yes.
actually see.
I agree.
Any last words, Michelle, before we say goodbye?
No, but thank you for coming, and I'm happy to answer any further questions that you may have. You can also, direct them to me. I'm happy to answer them as well.
Great. All right. Take care. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Be well.